The night Emma Brooks disappeared was supposed to be like any other Friday in Willow Creek. The small town, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. That night, the streets were quiet, save for the occasional sound of laughter drifting from a house party at the edge of town. Emma, a bright and spirited 17-year-old, was among the crowd, enjoying the last days of summer before school resumed. She was well-liked, the kind of girl who could light up a room with her laugh. As the party waned, Emma decided to head home. Her friends offered to walk with her, but she waved them off, insisting she'd be fine. It was only a 15-minute walk, and Willow Creek was safe, or so everyone believed. She pulled her jacket tighter around her as the cool night air settled in and started down the dimly lit road that wound through the heart of town. Joe Miller was closing up his food stand for the night when he spotted her walking by. His food stand, Joe's Grill, had become a fixture in Willow Creek over the past year. People loved his burgers, succulent, flavorful, and unlike anything they'd tasted before. Joe himself was polite, always quick with a smile, though he kept to himself. Most people didn't know much about him, and they didn't care to ask. Emma nodded at him as she passed, her smile polite but fleeting. Joe watched her for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to clean his grill. The hiss of the cleaning spray mixed with the low hum of the town's quiet night. By the time he looked up again, Emma was gone. The next morning, Emma's parents knew something was wrong. She hadn't come home, and her phone was going straight to voicemail. Panic set in quickly. They called her friends, but no one had seen her after she left the party. By mid-afternoon, the police were involved, and search parties were organized. Willow Creek's tight-knit community sprang into action, combing the woods, streets, and alleys for any sign of Emma. Joe joined the search like everyone else. He offered coffee to the volunteers and assured Emma's parents that they'd find her. His words were comforting, but his demeanor was eerily calm. As days passed with no leads, whispers began to circulate. Some claimed to have heard a car engine in the middle of the night, while others swore they saw a shadowy figure near the woods. Theories flourished, but none led anywhere concrete. Emma's best friend, Lily, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She remembered how Emma had mentioned feeling uneasy about Joe during a conversation weeks earlier. "There's something off about him," Emma had said. "I can't explain it, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes." Lily hesitated to share this with the police at first, not wanting to come off as paranoid. But as the days stretched into a week and the town's sense of safety began to erode, she found herself standing in the sheriff's office, repeating Emma's words. The sheriff, a no-nonsense man with 30 years on the job, listened carefully. He assured Lily that they would look into Joe, though he admitted they didn't have much to go on. Joe was cooperative and had no known criminal record. Still, the sheriff couldn't ignore the growing unease in his gut. As the sun set over Willow Creek, the search parties dwindled, and Emma's parents were left with the unbearable weight of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Joe's Grill continued to operate, the smell of grilled meat wafting through the air, drawing in customers as always. To everyone else, Joe was just another neighbor trying to help. But to those who looked a little closer, there was something unsettling about the way he watched the search efforts, his eyes cold and calculating, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Joe Miller had always been a mystery to the residents of Willow Creek. When he first arrived a year ago, driving an old, rusted pickup truck and towing a battered food stand, he slipped into the town's rhythm almost unnoticed. His polite demeanor and the irresistible smell of his burgers quickly won people over. Neighbors who rarely ventured beyond their routines began lining up at Joe's Grill, eager for a taste of his now famous creations. But beneath Joe's quiet charm lay a carefully guarded secret, one he would do anything to protect. Few people knew much about Joe's past. He claimed to have grown up in a neighboring state, bouncing between jobs until he decided to start his food stand. He spoke vaguely of a failed marriage and a desire for a fresh start, which the townsfolk accepted without question. What he didn't share was his history as a butcher, a job he'd held for nearly a decade before abruptly leaving under unclear circumstances. Joe's skills with meat were undeniable. He handled every patty with precision, seasoning and grilling each one to perfection. Customers marveled at the tenderness and rich flavor of his burgers, often joking that Joe must have a secret recipe. He would only smile and nod, deflecting their curiosity with a modest shrug. But in the privacy of his rented home on the outskirts of town, Joe's meticulous nature took on a darker form. The small shed in his backyard, hidden behind overgrown bushes, was his sanctuary. Inside, a steel table gleamed under the dim light of a single bulb, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. A heavy-duty meat grinder stood in one corner, its blades sharp and well-oiled. Joe's routine was disturbingly methodical. After closing his food stand each night, he would retreat to the shed, locking the door behind him. There, he would prepare his special ingredients, ensuring that no trace of his activities ever reached the outside world. His knowledge as a butcher allowed him to work with chilling efficiency, transforming flesh into neatly packed portions that blended seamlessly with the other meats in his inventory. Meanwhile, the search for Emma Brooks consumed the town. Flyers were plastered on every lamppost, and search parties combed the woods daily. Joe kept a low profile, offering words of support, but never drawing attention to himself. His food stand became a gathering point for weary volunteers, the aroma of his burgers providing a brief respite from their grim task. As the days turned into weeks, a new deputy in town, Officer Ryan Calloway, began to notice a pattern. He had recently transferred from a larger city and was familiar with unsolved cases of missing persons in rural areas. Something about Emma's disappearance reminded him of other cases he'd encountered, cases that left behind no trace, no leads, and no explanation. Calloway started digging into the town's history, searching for anything unusual. His investigation brought him to Joe's Grill, where he noted the way Joe seemed to avoid eye contact when Emma's name came up. Calloway's instincts told him there was more to Joe than met the eye, but without evidence, there was little he could do. Unaware that the officer's suspicions were growing, Joe continued his routine, confident that his secrets were safe. The trust he'd built within the community shielded him, allowing him to operate undetected. But as the pressure of Emma's disappearance mounted, cracks began to form in Joe's carefully constructed facade, threatening to expose the horrors he'd worked so hard to conceal. Cassie Green had always been drawn to the stories no one else wanted to touch. As a journalist for the Willow Creek Gazette, her work usually revolved around local fairs, town meetings, and the occasional high school sports achievement. But Emma Brooks' disappearance changed everything. The sleepy town that prided itself on safety and familiarity was suddenly at the center of a mystery. And Cassie, driven by a mix of professional ambition and personal curiosity, was determined to uncover the truth. The first thing that struck Cassie was the growing list of missing persons reports from neighboring towns. Though spread across several years, the cases bore an eerie resemblance. Young adults disappearing without a trace, no evidence of foul play, no bodies, and no suspects. It was as though they had simply vanished. Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that these cases were connected to Emma. But the idea seemed too outlandish for the local authorities, who were already stretched thin. Her investigation began with the people closest to Emma. Interviews with her family and friends painted a picture of a vibrant, kind-hearted girl who had no reason to run away. Her best friend, Lily, shared her unease about Joe Miller, recounting Emma's offhand comment about his unsettling demeanor. It was a flimsy lead, but it was something. Cassie decided to dig deeper into Joe's background. She scoured public records, but found very little, just a few scattered mentions of his food stand opening in other towns before he arrived in Willow Creek. She couldn't find any family ties, no property owned in his name, no social media presence. Joe seemed like a ghost, someone who existed only in the present with no trace of a past. Determined to learn more, Cassie began spending time near Joe's grill. She observed him as he worked, noting the precision of his movements and the way he interacted with customers. He was friendly but distant, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. She struck up a conversation with him one evening, complimenting his burgers and asking about his recipe. Joe's response was as polite as it was evasive. "It's all in the technique," he said with a small smile. "Years of practice." That night, Cassie followed Joe as he closed up his stand and drove home. She parked a safe distance away, watching as he carried a heavy, covered bin from his truck into the shed in his backyard. The way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, sent a chill down her spine. The next day, Cassie interviewed several townsfolk who frequented Joe's grill. Most raved about the food, but a few recalled peculiar details. One elderly man mentioned noticing a sharp, metallic smell near Joe's stand on occasion, though he dismissed it as the grease traps. Another woman laughed as she recounted how the stray dogs that once roamed near the food stand had disappeared shortly after Joe arrived. Cassie's unease grew with every story. She began compiling her notes, determined to confront the sheriff with her findings. But as she pieced together the puzzle, a gnawing fear settled in her chest. If her suspicions about Joe were right, then Emma Brooks, and perhaps others, had met a fate too horrifying to imagine. And if she was wrong, she risked alienating herself from the community and destroying an innocent man's reputation. Late one night, Cassie's phone buzzed with a text from an anonymous number. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Someone knew what she was doing. Someone was watching. Cassie Green parked her car a block away from Joe Miller's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The air outside was thick with the hum of cicadas, a sharp contrast to the quiet tension inside her vehicle. She had debated this for hours, weighing the risks against the need to uncover the truth. The warning text she had received still echoed in her mind. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." She didn't know who had sent it, but she was certain it was connected to Joe. If she stopped now, Emma Brooks, and perhaps others, would remain nothing more than unsolved mysteries. She stepped out of the car and moved silently toward Joe's backyard, her heart pounding in her chest. The shed she had seen him enter before loomed in the faint moonlight, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked ordinary at first glance, but Cassie knew better. Her instincts told her it was more than just a storage space. Carefully navigating the uneven ground, she approached the shed. Its small window was grimy and streaked with dirt, but a faint light shone from within. Cassie crouched low, peeking inside. The sight made her stomach turn. A steel table stood in the center, its surface scoured clean but still bearing faint stains. Tools hung neatly on the wall, knives, saws, and a cleaver that gleamed under the single overhead bulb. In the corner sat a large industrial freezer, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. Cassie's breath caught as she tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't the setup of an ordinary food vendor. It looked more like a butcher's workshop, clinical, precise, and deeply unsettling. She crept toward the shed door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. Locked. Of course, it would be locked. Frustration bubbled inside her, but she couldn't afford to make noise. Cassie fumbled with her phone, snapping a few grainy photos through the window. It wasn't much, but it was proof that something was wrong. As she stepped back to retreat, a sudden noise froze her in place. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they crunched against the gravel path leading to the backyard. Cassie's heart raced as she ducked behind a bush, her breathing shallow. Joe emerged from the shadows, his tall figure illuminated by the faint light spilling from the shed. He was carrying a large plastic bin, its lid secured tightly. Cassie's stomach churned as she imagined what might be inside. He set the bin down and unlocked the shed with a set of keys from his pocket. The door creaked open and Joe disappeared inside, taking the bin with him. Cassie remained hidden, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene. A few minutes later, Joe emerged, locking the door behind him. He glanced around the yard, his gaze lingering for a moment too long in her direction. Cassie held her breath, praying the darkness concealed her. Satisfied, Joe walked back to the house, the door clicking shut behind him. Cassie waited until the lights inside went dark before slipping away, her pulse still racing. She knew she had seen enough to take her concerns to the sheriff, but a part of her feared it wouldn't be enough. As she drove home, her thoughts churned. Joe Miller was hiding something sinister. The tools, the freezer, the plastic bin. It all pointed to a chilling possibility. But without concrete evidence, convincing the authorities would be an uphill battle. Cassie resolved to keep digging, even as the shadow of danger loomed over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a dangerous game, one where the stakes were life and death. But she also knew one thing for certain. If she didn't act, Emma Brooks and the other missing people might never have their stories told. The town of Willow Creek was changing. Fear had settled like a fog over its once peaceful streets. Another person had gone missing, a middle-aged man named Greg Harper, who was last seen at a local gas station. The disappearance sent shockwaves through the community, deepening the sense of unease that had been growing since Emma Brooks vanished weeks earlier. Joe Miller's food stand, however, was busier than ever. It had become a strange beacon for the townsfolk, a place to gather and share their worries over burgers that seemed to taste even better in the midst of their collective anxiety. Joe's calm demeanor and sympathetic words comforted some, but others couldn't help but notice the faint unease in his smile. Cassie Green was among those who couldn't ignore it. She had spent the last few days piecing together her findings, the tools in Joe's shed, the freezer, the plastic bin he had carried inside. Though she had shared her concerns with the sheriff, the lack of concrete evidence had stalled any official action. Frustrated but undeterred, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She returned to Joe's grill under the guise of a customer, her notebook tucked discreetly into her bag. As she stood in line, she overheard a group of volunteers discussing the search for Greg Harper. One of them mentioned a bloodhound brought in to track Greg's scent, which had led to the edge of town before abruptly stopping. When it was her turn to order, Cassie forced a smile as she handed Joe a $5 bill. "Your burgers are famous around here," she said casually. Joe chuckled. "Word gets around in a small town. Have you ever thought about expanding? Maybe opening a restaurant?" Joe's smile tightened. "I like keeping things simple," he said. Cassie's eyes flicked to the grill behind him. The sizzling meat emitted its usual tantalizing aroma, but now the smell made her stomach churn. She accepted her burger and stepped aside, pretending to enjoy her meal as she watched him work. The opportunity she'd been waiting for came later that evening. The town's health inspector had finally visited Joe's grill after receiving an anonymous tip, Cassie's tip. As the inspector rummaged through Joe's supplies, she noticed him hesitate near the trash bin. A stained cloth caught his eye, and he held it up for a closer look. "What's this?" the inspector asked, his tone sharp. Joe's usual composure faltered. "Just grease from the grill," he said quickly. But Cassie, watching from the sidewalk, could see the unease in his movements. The cloth wasn't just greasy, it was smeared with something darker, something that looked suspiciously like blood. The inspector bagged the cloth as potential evidence, and the growing crowd of onlookers whispered among themselves. Joe's polite smile reappeared, but it no longer held the same charm. It was strained, almost forced, as if the mask he'd worn so carefully was beginning to crack. Cassie felt a surge of vindication, but also a pang of dread. She knew this was only the beginning. The cloth might lead to more questions, more scrutiny, but if Joe sensed the walls closing in, how far would he go to protect his secret? As the crowd began to disperse, Cassie lingered, her instincts screaming that something big was about to happen. Joe caught her gaze for a fleeting moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Cassie's breath hitched. She had spent weeks trying to uncover his secret, but now she wondered if she had underestimated him. The tension in Willow Creek was palpable, a town on the edge of unraveling. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness seemed to carry with it the promise of answers, or perhaps more horrors.